In the year 2018, neoliberalism means different things to different people. And it shouldn't. There should be, at this point, one well-articulated understanding of what neoliberalism means, at least at the elite academic level, and preferably around the world, even in the lowly news media and so on, and there really isn't. Neoliberalism has become a punching bag for the left wing, but nobody even knows in what direction they're punching. I don't know, can I mix metaphors here? It's an invisible punching bag. It's a somewhat blurry punching bag that nobody's quite sure, no one's quite sure when they're striking a blow, because there isn't a common understanding, certainly not with any depth, of what neoliberalism means or what it is that they're criticizing. Neoliberalism is absolutely worthy of criticism. It is, I think, one of the most successful ideologies in the history of humankind. It's certainly the most successful political ideology within my lifetime. And it is an ideology that is now starting to go out of fashion. However, it's not on the verge of some kind of dramatic collapse. Nobody is presuming that neoliberalism is going to go through, it's going to be discredited the way the Soviet Union was discredited. It's hard to even imagine what that would mean. But certainly neoliberalism has started to raise some questions that may spark different people in different parts of the world to come up with some new answers. It may, as a paradigm, finally go out of fashion or be discarded. But it is saddening to see that the critics of neoliberalism still to this day are so incapable of even articulating what it is or identifying with any precision what it is they're morally objecting to. So it's remain a kind of lame area of political science discourse. Now, when you say that somebody is a critic of something, I think on a linguistic and cultural level, we tend to presume that they really have a very high level of expertise in the thing it is they're criticizing, that they're conversant in it, that they know the genre very well. If I tell you that I'm a jazz critic, right away you assume quite a high level of appreciation for jazz on my part. If I tell you that I'm a critic of the fine arts, of painting or what have you, again, simply by virtue of being a critic of this field, you assume I'm really immersed in it. And the reality is, the people who describe themselves as critics of neoliberalism are very much the opposite. They're people who feel morally superior to neoliberalism and who take absolutely no interest in really understanding what it is in its own terms, who have no sympathy with the people on the other side of the aisle, why it was they, for their part, sincerely and idealistically supported and advanced neoliberalism. They certainly don't read the literature of neoliberalism. They don't read any of the foundational texts in the art form. They're not conversant even with what it is they're criticizing politically. So, you may say that this is a problem across the board. I don't think it is. I mean, to be honest with you, I think this is an unusual example of political science, not just as an academic discipline, but as a phenomenon, political commentary in our society, fumbling the ball when everyone knows this is really one of the major talking points, one of the major challenges, intellectual and political challenges of our time. So I received an email, actually a message within Patreon from a supporter. Pay $1 a month, support this channel if you want to, blah, blah, blah. Asking me, in effect, what my opinion was on Donald Trump's latest moves from Donald Trump that have to some extent threatened the status quo in terms of, global trade hierarchies, the assumptions of the globalization of free trade that have been one pillar of neoliberalism, but I would emphasize free trade accords of this kind, they are one element of neoliberalism. They're very far from the only element. There's more to it than just that. However, that's most of what we're going to focus on in this video. It's really important to point out, again, I've said this many times in many different contexts, sympathy is an analytical tool. Don't sympathize with people just for the sake of being a sympathetic human being, or because I think sympathy is somehow morally superior to a lack of sympathy. If you really want to study what happened in the Vietnam War or in the American bombing of Cambodia, it's important that you know enough that you can look at the decisions made by Richard Nixon. Nixon was the president of the United States, and you could say, yeah, I understand how, if I were in his position, I might have made that decision too. I might have done something like that. It's not useful to behave, as I say, many of the critics of neoliberalism do, as if, oh, I'm at a great distance from this topic. I would never deign to, I would never touch this with a 10-foot pole. No, roll up your sleeves, get your hands dirty, learn enough and get close enough to the subject matter that you can sympathize with the decision making going on the other side, especially with a mass ideological and political phenomenon like neoliberalism. Now, it's true, if I were in the position of power that Tony Blair was in England for such a long time, I wouldn't have made any of the decisions he made. They're terrible decisions. I mean, politically, I don't have sympathy for elite level, executive level neoliberal world leaders, and Tony Blair is a very important example of one. However, I can also look at his political career, look at the assumptions he had when he came into office, look at what he values as a person. I can even look at, the sort of unexamined assumptions he has about the role and function of government and who he asks for advice, which policy positions he even considers, and how political priorities are set in his administration. And I can see how it is that the pattern of governance emerges from these factors. I can sympathize in that sense, even if I sympathize with a sense of revulsion for the subject matter being examined here. But yes, neoliberal leaders like Tony Blair, I feel that I've lived through an incredibly bleak period of human history this way. I know that may sound like an exaggeration. I've heard some conservatives and right-wingers say that this is the greatest time, to be alive. I only hear conservatives saying that. It's real. Why is it? Anyway, it's peculiar. Only conservatives say that, and only conservatives seem to say that our culture is on the brink of imminent collapse. These things seem to go together. The idea that we're currently in a golden age and that it's incredibly fragile and, it's going to collapse at any point. There's a certain kind of paranoid style to conservative political discourse these days. But, growing up with Bill Clinton in power, I mean, I do have memories earlier than Bill Clinton, but I mean, to go from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush, and now, George W. Bush to Barack Obama, and now from Barack Obama to Donald Trump. Yeah, in many ways, I do feel I've lived through an incredibly bleak period in politics. And, look, I'm going to throw out some examples here, but the underlying bleakness is, frankly, the feeling that in politics that nobody cares. And, perhaps that is much more depressing than being in a society or in a period of time when it seems like everyone's a fanatic. So, you guys know, I just recently read a book about the history of the English Civil War. 1640s, but anyway, 1630s, 40s, 50s, the war and its consequences go on and on. But, in the 17th century, you're reading this history, and people seem so passionate about politics. They seem so passionate about very basic foundational concepts in politics, like the role of parliament and the role of the king and the role of the law and the role of democracy, and, to what extent should voters be represented just because they're human beings, and to what extent does it based on how many, whether or not they pay taxes or whether or not they supported the right side in the war, were really basic concepts people seem to be tremendously passionate about, and at the same time fanatical about, and at the same time they're stabbing each other up. There are a lot of knife fights, a lot of duels to the death, breaking out of this stuff because people were really passionate about politics. And now I'm living through a period of history. I mean, this is one of the foundational concepts in neoliberal political ideology. One of the fundamental ideological claims of neoliberalism was that the globalization, I guess I can say the global liberalization of trade, which is referred to as globalization, would lead to lasting peace as never before. Because as one country became deeply involved in the manufacturing process and financial investment process of another, there would be an ineluctable progress towards passivism on both sides. So the idea is here, in as much as Germany is reliant on oil exports from Russia, then Germany becomes very reluctant to do anything that would provoke a war with Russia. Now, this is true. It's true, it's just giving an incredibly flattering description to what's really a very bleak and demoralizing situation. There are human rights and democracy in Russia is maybe a 1 out of 10. And by the way, these are unofficial ratings. There is a ratings agency. Freedom House is the name of a charity. It's existed for a very long time, and they give an annual ranking to every country in the world for how democratic they are and how good or how bad the human rights situation is. So they give a score. I think it's from 1 to 5, not 1 to 10. But you can look it up. What is the rating this year for Russia? How close are they to getting a 0 in terms of the quality of human rights and democracy? However, a country like Russia is definitely a few points up compared to Saudi Arabia. In Russia they have some democracy and some human rights, but but not remotely enough. Well, guess what? Germany is not in a position to criticize Russia precisely because of this form of economic interdependence. That is the type of term you'd see. I mean, if you read pro-neoliberal texts from the early period where these ideas were being sincerely and hopefully propounded. I mean, neoliberalism promised, the end of slavery and the end of war. There were people who were really sincere believers in this. It also promised the end to non-tariff trade barriers. It's a little bit more technical, but if you care about economics, you might care about that too. The globalization of trade was supposed to bring about a new era of both peace and prosperity, and indeed of rising salaries for the poor, increasing and improving, human rights. Now, there is some truth to their claims. There really is. I mean, it's really worth examining how the world has changed between 1990 and 2018. And I think there are some accomplishments that we've got to give the neoliberals credit for. But precisely what they've described here so positively, the flip side too is incredibly depressing. Okay, so you have economic interdependence between Germany and Russia. So Russia invades the Ukraine outright, starts slaughtering and torturing people. And yes, I've read detailed, specific accounts of crimes against humanity, of atrocities committed by Russian forces in the Ukraine that will give you nightmares. They're horrifying. Sometimes by Russian troops themselves, sometimes by mercenaries employed by the Russians. It is complex on the ground there who is working for whom, but everyone knows Russia is predominantly responsible for what's been going on that part of the Ukraine. Okay, so because economically you're dependent on Russian oil in Germany, in France, and so on, you're not going to stand up and do the right thing? Now, and on a huge scale, this is the situation with Saudi Arabia. I mean, what is Saudi Arabia on a scale of 1 to 10 for democracy and human rights? Who is going to stand up and say to Saudi Arabia, no, you have to meet this minimum standard of democracy and human rights? There was an assumption in neoliberalism that as part of this unraveling progress of the world, that the minimum standards of democracy, human rights, scientific and technological progress would all pull up the countries that were at the bottom of the rankings. That countries like Saudi Arabia and Russia, no longer communist Russia, post-communist Russia, would be pulled up to the top of the ranks. Now, technologically, this has happened. I mean, scientifically and technologically, a country like Saudi Arabia has made unbelievable progress. A country like China has made unbelievable progress. But how much pressure has there been on China to meet minimum standards of human rights and democracy? Nil. Zero. If anything, and one of my professors here, Professor Wu Guang, wrote a book about this. I could do a book review of it. I could not. Some people say there's even a disincentive. That not only is there no positive incentive to meet these higher standards, but that globalization and neoliberalism provide an incentive going the other way. So the question is to be asked, if Donald Trump is now going to bring about a collapse of that globalized free trade system, if this is the first step towards a new era of politics being more fundamentally protectionist, more tariff-based, so anti-global free trade, being anti-free trade, anti-immigration, anti-refugee, more a matter of isolated national units protecting their own interests, instead of engaging in free trade even when it's not in their interest. Because on a mathematical level, guys, you can just look up, you can Google right now, U.S. balance of payments deficit. I mean, in terms of the value of what the United States is exporting versus the value of what it's importing, there have always been reasons to be alarmed about globalization and the impact it has in the United States. There have always been reasons to be alarmed about the North American Free Trade Agreement, the free trade agreement that America has just with Mexico, and the impacts that's had on the American economy. This isn't new. It's really not. These questions have been on the table for a long time. And because of the faith in neoliberalism, especially amongst governing elites, nobody's been coming up with new answers to those questions. So yes, it is possible that Donald Trump could signal the start of a new era of coming up with new answers to those old questions. It's also possible that he's just a bump in the road, and as soon as Donald Trump is out of power, the next person who's elected is going to restore all these free trade agreements, and it will go back to the status quo that was unquestioned. That was unquestioned, for example, by Obama, and unquestioned by George W. Bush before, so on and so forth. If we have this breakdown of international economic interdependence, if we have a move more towards self-reliance, either for nations economically, or what's more likely for national blocs, smaller blocs of nations. I mean, obviously, the Netherlands is not going to try to be self-reliant, but maybe you're going to have smaller clusters of some of those countries with trade barriers around them. Obviously, the United States and Canada would be very likely to form a trade bloc unto themselves, but probably excluding Mexico. Evidently, they're already, breaking off the possibility of a lot of other international trade agreements, past, present, and future. If you move more into that world, is it possible that this will be a net benefit for human rights or indeed animal rights? This is one of the reasons I got this question. Is it possible that when the United States ceases making money exporting meat to Europe and China, you're going to get a reconsideration of these things? Well, it's not impossible. I mean, we live in a very peculiar era when scrutiny and political participation have never been cheaper and have never been easier. And yet, public indifference is at an all-time high. It's tremendously depressing to live in a period of time where the leitmotif of politics is nobody cares. It's not just the case that people in the United States don't care about human rights in Saudi Arabia. People in Canada don't care about human rights on First Nations reserves. They don't care about human rights for the Cree and the Ojibwe. People in the United States, nobody seems to care about the fact that human rights in Florida. I mean, I'm sorry, but Florida, it really is a good example in the United States where the quality of government has deteriorated to an absolutely terrifying point. You can come up with all kinds of examples of that. It's also true, there's indifference, both local and international, breakdown of law and order and basic human rights in Mexico. So it's not easy to say that because the problem is far away, people are indifferent to it. When you have examples of this profound indifference within each of these countries, of course, even within the United Kingdom or what have you, where both the governing elites and, the hoi polloi, the mass of regular humanity and voters, fundamentally do not care, even though now they can have access to information instantly and for free over the internet. You can find exactly the information on exactly that topic. You don't have to go down to an archive in a downtown major city and leaf through government publications. I used to do that stuff. I remember what it was like. The technology of getting the information and having an informed opinion is incredibly simple. And even the technology of sending in your opinion. If you want to write a letter to Parliament, if you want to contact, your member of Parliament, what have you, if you want to protest, if you want to give a deposition at City Hall, everything has become infinitely easier than it was just a few decades ago. And yet the motivation is utterly lacking. So if Donald Trump now, let's say he starts the ball rolling for, a general collapse in international trade agreements. And for that collapse to happen, what you'd really need is a shift in attitude amongst ruling elites, where they stop looking at an abstract greater good of assuming that infinite deregulated free trade is good for all parties, and they instead start looking at their own workers, their own unemployment, the value of what they're producing, the value of what they're exporting versus what they're importing, and start saying, okay, how can we make balance of payments? How can we optimize our economy? Not necessarily in a protectionist way. Protectionism is one response to that, but just basically where they start looking out for their own national self-interest instead of working on the dogmatic assumption that unlimited free trade is going to benefit all parties more than any specific interventions, guidelines, tariffs, or what have you. If you have that kind of a shift, then you're going to have the decline both of actual economic interdependence, and you're going to have the decline of the ideology, which is one crucial part of neoliberalism. You're going to have the decline of the ideology that economic cooperation itself is the engine for the improvement of democracy and human rights. And a great example of this, you got to be old enough to remember it, when Bill Clinton went to China. Bill Clinton made a long trip to China, long journey, And at that time, one of the big issues in China was the status of Tibet and the lack of human rights for Tibetans and whether or not Tibet would ever get its independence. Bill Clinton was the first president of the United States to give the Chinese, i.e. to admit that Tibet was a province of China. Prior to that, every president of the United States said, no, we don't recognize Tibet as part of China, that Tibet had some right to exist as an independent country that had been wrongfully annexed by China in terms of international law. And Bill Clinton shrugged his shoulders and said, okay, Tibet will forever remain a part of China. In terms of the words given by Bill Clinton himself and by people who were in his office, and again, down to the newspapers and so on, the pleasing illusion that everyone spun was, no, there's no point in barricading them. There's no point in cutting them off from international trade and punishing them. There's no point in treating communist China the way the United States was treating communist Cuba. It's a total hypocrisy, right? There's no point imposing on China the same kind of isolation from world trade that Cuba has. There's no point in isolation. The way forward is through engagement. That through exactly trade, that's the engagement we're talking about here. We're not talking about, we're not talking about taking Chinese members of parliament and giving them a guided tour of Congress and explaining to them how elections work. We're not talking about any other kind of engagement. We're just saying that by the free flow, basically, of money, investment, technology, and, economic integration. That's what really happened. One of the great examples, this was from The Economist magazine, the Barbie doll would be quote-unquote made in China, but it was an American company, and all the design was done in America, and all the parts would be sent to China, including even the paint. They'd just be assembled and painted and put in the package in China and then sent back to America. The breakdown of where the components came from. A remarkably large percentage of the value of the iPhone, the Apple iPhone, actually goes to Germany because so many of the fine components are made in Germany and then shipped to China and assembled. The extent to which economic production, manufacturing has been integrated internationally since then, it's unbelievable. And it's true. This integration, this form of economic interdependence, creates a disincentive for war. It also creates a disincentive for any kind of political scrutiny of one country against another. I think there's an argument to be made. It also leads to a disincentive in domestic policy for governments taking responsibility for their own economy. For example, for the plight of their own workers. And this isn't new. You can go back to the 1980s and people were already saying, if we have free trade with Mexico, then car manufacturing car factories are going to close down in Detroit and move to Mexico. And in many cases, this was literally true, where the factory was disassembled, the parts of the factory, the machinery, were moved to Mexico, placed in a new factory, and started manufacturing the same car parts just across the border, right? So, I remember I read an article that went into detail about a factory. This was absolutely, literally true. The machinery itself was relocated to Mexico, a new factory was built, and so on. Whether the jobs go to Mexico or the jobs go to China, this is an old story. This criticism of neoliberalism isn't something new, but the question is, will people now start coming up with new answers? Will governments, and specifically most of these countries, government really is an oligarchy. It's controlled by a small elite. It's controlled by people like Donald Trump. Will people start caring more about the national weal, which includes very much the status of the poor, or will they continue to subscribe to a specific version of laissez-faire economics that unlimited freedom of investment, import, export, and trade will lead to an optimal situation for the rich and the poor alike, even when we have such glaringly obvious evidence that this isn't the case, and when, as in the case of China, Saudi Arabia, and even Russia, it's proven that politically, in terms of democracy and human rights, the real-world outcome of neoliberal globalization is not that the exchange of technology leads to all of the boats floating up on a rising tide, to rising higher and higher levels of human rights and democracy. On the contrary, what this tends to lead to is a race to the bottom, where countries are not just competing for the lowest wages, for internationally competitive manufacturing conditions and what have you, but where also human rights and democracy itself, if anything, there's an incentive for these to remain at a minimal level, or at a very low level indeed, where there is no pressure on Thailand to have elections when Thailand went from being a democracy to a dictatorship. There's no pressure on Russia for it to meet minimum standards of democracy and human rights, so on for Saudi Arabia and China. And guess what, guys? As I think I've already mentioned, back in the year 2000, when the United States had a phony rigged election, the election of George W. Bush, there was absolutely no pressure on the United States to meet any kind of minimum standards of democracy and human rights either. So it cuts both ways. Okay? If you want to ask me a question like this and get a 25-minute answer, hit me up on Patreon. Pay $1 to support the existence of this channel. I know the person who asked me this question may not be happy with my answer, but hey, satisfaction is not guaranteed, but getting a thought-provoking answer is guaranteed. And I got to tell you guys, I appreciate the question. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about this. Before I made this video, I searched my own channel for the word neoliberalism. I've done remarkably few videos expressly about this topic. I think many have mentioned it. And I'm burdened with the awareness. Although I opened this video complaining I have all this experience in academia, meeting and talking to people with PhDs and seeing their publications, seeing their articles and have you. Seeing how in academia very, very few of the professors, even in their formal writing and research, are really capable of addressing neoliberalism in a meaningful way. I know that remarkably few of the professors are able to give this kind of spontaneous conversation about neoliberalism and its implications. So I do feel a little bit of a shred of responsibility to take what I know and share it. It was clear to me, even when I was an undergraduate, that neoliberalism, its origin, its nature, and its future fate was going to be one of the most important questions for my generation, and it still is. When you're living through that time, it's really easy to trivialize these people. It's really easy to laugh at someone like Tony Blair and think that his ideas don't matter because he's such a fool. It's easy to laugh at George W. Bush and think, oh, well, all this will be over in 8 years. Look, how many decades have you got left? Any of us? I mean, it's sad, but this is your time. This is your generation. This is the fate of your world. And I think you need to have the honesty and the vulnerability to look at what's come and gone with people like Tony Blair, the opportunity that's come and gone with someone like Barack Obama, someone like George W. Bush, and realize this is it. I mean, this is your world. This is your generation's, contribution to politics and so on. You can sit back in indifference. You can sit back with sneering contempt. You can exercise this sense of phony moral superiority, as I think most of the critics of neoliberalism do, and say, oh, well, many Americans just say, oh, well, he's not my president. They talk as if they feel no connection to this. Or you need to have the humility to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty. Get involved, have some sympathy for the devil, realize what's motivating the people on the other side, what their illusions and delusions are, and maybe what their sincere goals are. And you have to take up the heartbreaking work of trying to make a difference in a world that is fundamentally indifferent, more indifferent than ever before, despite having more access to information, more access to government than ever before. That's the road we've got cut out for us in what remains the 21st century.